There are men who build empires, and then there are men who get trapped inside them. Ethan Cole was both. By every measurable standard, he had everything. At 36, he was the CEO of Cole Industries, a name that commanded respect in boardrooms and fear in competitors. His decisions moved markets. His silence unsettled people. His presence alone could freeze a room. But none of that followed him home. His penthouse was always quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It echoed. That night, like many others, Ethan drove without direction. The city lights of Manhattan blurred past him, glowing but distant, like a life he couldn't quite touch. He wasn't heading anywhere. He rarely was. His hand hovered over the radio dial, flipping through stations without interest. News, music, ads, nothing held him. Until a voice did. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who carry the heaviest silence. His fingers stilled. The voice was soft, steady, and unhurried. It didn't demand attention, it earned it. There was warmth in it. Not forced. Not rehearsed. Real. Ethan leaned back slightly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. I don't know who needs to hear this tonight, the woman continued gently, but you're allowed to rest. You don't have to fight every battle alone. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan didn't change the station. He listened. Her name, he would soon learn, was Lila Harper. A late-night radio host with a way of speaking that felt personal. As if she understood things she had no business understanding. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel like the most powerful man in the room. He felt like a man being spoken to, without judgment, without expectation. And for the first time in years, he stayed. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because somehow he didn't want to leave. Ethan told himself it was nothing. Just a voice on the radio. A coincidence. A passing moment in an otherwise predictable life. But the next night, without thinking, he found himself in his car again. Same time. Same silence. Same station. You'd be surprised how many people feel alone in rooms full of others. Lila Harper's voice flowed through the speakers, calm and steady as ever. Ethan didn't question why he'd tuned in again. He simply listened. At first, it was just background noise, something to fill the emptiness of his drive. But over the next few days, it became something else. Something intentional. He began adjusting his schedule, leaving the office just in time to catch the start of her show. Meetings were cut short. Calls postponed. Even his assistant noticed the subtle shift, though Ethan gave no explanation. Every night it was the same ritual. Drive. Silence. Her voice. And every night she spoke as if she understood something about him. Something even he hadn't fully faced. Some people don't open up, she said one evening. Not because they don't feel, but because they've learned no one stays long enough to understand. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't possible for her to know that. And yet, it felt like she did. He never called in. Never texted. Never left a trace. He remained what he had always been, distant, controlled, unseen. But this time he was the one listening. Not commanding. Not leading. Just listening. Back at the office, his presence was still as intimidating as ever, but something had changed. The sharp edge in his voice had softened, just slightly. His decisions, while still firm, carried a patience that hadn't been there before. No one could explain it. No one except a woman who had never met him. A woman whose voice had somehow found its way into the one place Ethan Cole had locked away from the world. His quiet, guarded heart. And now, without realizing it, he was coming back every night, just to hear it again. By the end of the second week, it was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. Every night at exactly 11 p.m., Ethan Cole was in his car, engine idling or moving slowly through quiet streets, tuned into the same station. He no longer flipped through channels. There was nothing else worth hearing. Only her. Tonight, Lila Harper's voice carried gently through the airwaves. I want to hear from you. Tell me something you've never said out loud before. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers resting against the steering wheel. Colin? He almost scoffed at the idea. Men like him didn't call radio shows. They didn't confess. They didn't share. His entire life had been built on control, on keeping things contained, hidden, untouchable. And yet, for a brief moment, his hand moved toward his phone. Then stopped. No. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the dim road ahead. This was enough. Listening was enough. Callers began pouring in, voices filled with emotion, stories of heartbreak, regret, hope. Lila responded to each one with the same calm understanding, never rushing, never dismissing. Ethan listened more closely than he ever had before. Not to the callers. To her. He noticed the way she paused before responding, as if choosing her words with care. The quiet strength in her tone. The sincerity that couldn't be faked. She wasn't just speaking. She was connecting. At the small radio station across the city, Lila adjusted her headphones, glancing briefly at the glowing dashboard in front of her. Listener counts rose and fell as usual, but one detail had caught her attention over the past several nights. A consistent signal. Same time. Same duration. Someone was always there from beginning to end. Silent. Unmoving. She smiled faintly to herself. "Whoever you are," she said softly into the microphone, her voice almost thoughtful now, "thank you for staying." Ethan's breath caught just slightly. It was irrational. There were thousands of listeners. And yet, it felt like she was speaking directly to him. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't reach for his phone. But for the first time, Ethan Cole wasn't just listening to a voice in the dark. He was hoping it noticed him back. It took him 3 nights to write it. Not because the words were complicated, but because they weren't. Ethan Cole wasn't used to saying things plainly. In his world, everything was calculated, layered, and strategic. Even silence had meaning. Especially silence. But this was different. He sat in his car, engine off, the city unusually still around him. Lila's voice filled the space, soft as ever, speaking to another caller. Ethan barely heard it. His focus was on the screen in his hand. A blank message box. He typed. Deleted. Typed again. Paused. For a man who negotiated million-dollar deals without hesitation, this felt strangely difficult. Finally, with a quiet exhale, he wrote, "Do people like me deserve peace?" He stared at the words. No name. No detail. No explanation. Just truth, bare and unguarded. For a moment he considered deleting it again. It felt too revealing, too exposed. But before doubt could take over completely, he pressed send. And just like that, it was out there. Ethan set his phone aside, his expression unreadable, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He told himself it didn't matter. It was just another message in a sea of many. She might not even see it. But she did. Back in the studio, Lila's eyes scanned the incoming messages. One of them made her pause. It was short, simple, but heavy. She leaned closer to the microphone, her tone shifting, gentler, more deliberate. "Someone just asked," she began softly, "do people like me deserve peace?" Ethan's chest tightened. "There's no such thing as people like you in that sense," she continued. "There are just people who've been through things, who've made choices, who've carried burdens longer than they should have." Her voice didn't judge. It didn't question. It understood. "And yes," she added quietly, "you deserve peace. Not because you're perfect, but because you're human." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. For the first time in a long time, the weight he carried didn't feel quite as permanent. And for the first time, he wasn't just listening anymore. He had been heard. After that night, silence was no longer enough. Ethan didn't plan to send another message, but the next evening, as Lila's voice filled the quiet space of his car, his phone was already in his hand. This time the words came faster. "What if you've hurt people and can't fix it?" He sent it before he could overthink it. There was something unsettling about how easy it was becoming. This quiet honesty with a stranger who didn't know his name, his face, or the empire he controlled. With her, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a voice in the dark. Lila read the message moments later. "Someone asked," she said softly, "what if you've hurt people and can't fix it?" Ethan's gaze fixed ahead, his attention sharpening. "There are things we can't undo," she continued, her tone thoughtful. "But that doesn't mean we're beyond redemption. Sometimes making peace isn't about going back, it's about choosing to be better moving forward." Her words settled into him not as a command, but as a possibility. That night Ethan didn't drive as long. He went home. And for once, the silence in his penthouse didn't feel as suffocating. Over the next week, the messages continued. Short, honest, unfiltered. "I don't trust people. I don't know how to stop working. I don't remember the last time I felt calm." Each time Lila responded with the same steady warmth, never pushing, never prying, only guiding. And slowly something shifted. At Cole Industries the change became noticeable. Ethan still walked into meetings with authority, his presence still commanding, but the sharp edge had softened. He listened more. Interrupted less. Even his assistant, Rachel, caught herself staring once or twice, unsure what had altered in him. He wasn't less powerful. Just less distant. But the biggest change wasn't visible to anyone else. It happened in quiet moments, when Ethan found himself waiting for 11 p.m., not out of habit anymore but anticipation. Because somewhere between the questions and the answers, between the silence and the voice, the man who had built walls around his heart was beginning, slowly, to let something through. While Ethan Cole was slowly changing in ways no one could explain, Lila Harper remained exactly who she had always been. Simple. Steady. Unseen. Her world was far from the towering buildings and polished boardrooms Ethan moved through daily. She lived in a small apartment above a quiet bookstore, where the scent of old pages lingered in the air and the creak of wooden floors had become a familiar comfort. Her mornings were slow, often beginning with tea by the window, watching the city wake up without rushing to meet it. By afternoon she was preparing for her show, reviewing messages, organizing thoughts, and grounding herself for the voices she would carry through the night. Because that's what she believed she was doing. Carrying people. One story at a time. Lila didn't see herself as extraordinary. If anything, she thought of herself as someone who had simply learned how to listen, because life had once left her wishing someone had listened to her. That night, her voice was softer than usual. Loneliness doesn't always look the way people expect, she said gently. Sometimes it hides behind success, behind strength, behind the people everyone assumes are doing just fine. Ethan sat still in his car, every word landing deeper than the last. Sometimes, she continued, it's not about having no one around you, it's about feeling like no one really sees you. For a moment, the city outside faded completely. Ethan wasn't thinking about work, or meetings, or expectations. He was thinking about her. Not just the voice anymore, but the person behind it. Who was she really? What had she been through to speak this way, with so much understanding, so much quiet strength? For the first time, curiosity began to replace distance. And miles away, sitting behind a microphone, Lila glanced at the same familiar signal that had been there every night. Still listening. Still silent. She smiled faintly, unaware that the man behind that silence, the one she had unknowingly reached night after night, was no longer content with just listening. He wanted to know her. Not just her voice, but her world. Curiosity for Ethan Cole was never a passive thing. It moved. It acted. It uncovered. For weeks, he had allowed the connection to remain untouched, pure in its distance, safe in its anonymity. But something had shifted. The questions he once asked about himself were now turning outward. Toward her. Lila Harper. Her name lingered in his mind long after each broadcast ended. One morning, standing in his glass-walled office with the city stretched beneath him, Ethan made a decision he could no longer ignore. Find her, he said simply. His head of security didn't ask questions. People rarely did. Within hours, the search began, not invasive, not reckless, but precise. Public records. Employment details. Background information. Ethan told himself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. But when the file finally landed on his desk, he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it, as if crossing an invisible line. Because once he knew, everything would change. Still, he opened it. Lila Harper. Late 20s. Radio host. No major affiliations. No scandals. No hidden fame. Just a quiet life built around something real. There were photos. Ethan hesitated before looking. Then he did. And for a moment, the world he knew, the structured, controlled, predictable world, felt distant. She wasn't what he expected. There was no extravagance. No polished perfection. Just something genuine. Something calm. Something grounding. He leaned back in his chair, the file resting loosely in his hand. So this was the woman whose voice had found him in the quiet. The woman who had spoken to him without knowing who he was, without expecting anything in return. Ethan could have gone to her that same day. He had the power, the means, the access, but he didn't. Because for the first time he understood something unusual. This connection mattered more because it wasn't forced. Because she didn't know him. Because she chose her words freely without influence or fear. And somehow, that made them more real. So instead of stepping into her world, Ethan stayed where he was, listening, watching from a distance, protecting something fragile that had quietly become the most honest part of his life. Fate, Ethan had learned, was rarely something you could predict. But this time, it felt intentional. Cole Media is finalizing the acquisition this week, his assistant, Rachel, said, placing a file neatly on his desk. One of the subsidiaries includes a late-night radio division. Small but consistent audience. Ethan didn't react immediately, but his attention sharpened. Schedule the meeting, he said calmly. Rachel nodded and left, unaware that something far more personal than business had just been set into motion. The building was modest compared to Ethan's usual standards. No towering glass exterior. No polished marble floors. Just a quiet structure tucked into the rhythm of the city, unassuming, almost easy to overlook. But not to him. As Ethan stepped inside, his presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. Conversations hushed. Movements slowed. People noticed him the way they always did, with a mix of curiosity and caution. He barely registered any of it. Because for the first time he wasn't there as a CEO. He was there for her. Down the hallway behind a glass panel marked Studio B, Lila Harper adjusted her headphones, preparing for another night on air. She didn't know he was there. Didn't know that just beyond that door stood the man who had been listening to her every night. The man whose silence she had grown quietly aware of. Ethan stopped a few steps away from the studio. And then he saw her. Not through a file. Not through a photograph. But in motion. Real. Lila sat comfortably in her chair, flipping through notes, her expression calm and focused. There was something about the way she carried herself, unrushed, grounded, that immediately matched the voice he had come to know. It wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. For a brief moment Ethan forgot everything else. Then, she looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. It lasted only a second. Two strangers. No recognition. But something passed between them, something quiet, unspoken, and impossible to define. Lila offered a polite, almost instinctive smile before returning her attention to her notes. Ethan didn't move. Because in that brief moment something shifted again. The distance that had once protected their connection was gone. And now, for the first time, their worlds had touched. After that moment outside the studio, silence no longer felt safe. Ethan returned to his car that night, but he didn't turn the engine on. He sat there, staring ahead, Lila's voice playing softly through the speakers as it always did. But this time, everything was different. He had seen her. Not as a distant voice, but as a real person with a quiet smile and a presence that felt grounding in a way he couldn't explain. And now, hiding behind anonymity felt less like protection. And more like distance he didn't want anymore. The next evening Ethan didn't wait in his car. He walked back into the station. No hesitation this time. No second guessing. Just intention. "Mr. Cole?" the station manager greeted quickly, surprised. "We weren't expecting." "I'm here to see Lila Harper," Ethan said calmly. There was something in his tone, firm but not cold, that made it clear this wasn't business. Inside the studio, Lila had just ended her segment when there was a light knock at the door. "Come in," she said, removing her headphones. The door opened, and there he was. For a moment she simply looked at him, recognizing the face, the presence, the weight he carried into the room. "Mr. Cole," she said politely, standing up. "I didn't expect." "I listened to your show," he interrupted gently. That made her pause. There was something in his voice now, something quieter than she expected from a man like him. "I'm glad you do," she replied softly. "It means a lot." Ethan took a step closer, his gaze steady, not intimidating this time, just honest. "I'm the one who sends the messages." The room went still. Lila blinked, processing. "The anonymous ones?" she asked. He nodded. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but full. "You?" she repeated, almost in disbelief. Ethan gave a faint, almost self-aware exhale. "Yes." For a moment Lila didn't speak. She simply studied him, not as a CEO, not as a powerful man, but as someone who had quietly shared pieces of himself without expecting anything back. And then she understood. Not his status, not his power, but his loneliness. "You were never really asking questions, were you?" she said gently. "You were looking for something steady?" Ethan met her gaze. "Yes." No hesitation. No mask. Just truth. And in that moment, the distance between them, built on silence, curiosity, and unseen connection, finally disappeared. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise or drama. They simply settle. Quietly. Completely. That was how it felt for Lila Harper and Ethan Cole after the truth was finally spoken. No grand declarations followed. No rushed decisions. No dramatic turning away or sudden certainty. Just a shared silence that no longer felt empty. It felt understood. In the days that followed, Ethan did something he had never done before. He slowed down. Not because the world demanded it, but because for once he didn't want to move through it alone. He began showing up at the station, not as a CEO but as himself. At first, Lila treated it cautiously, unsure how to define what they were becoming. But there was no pressure from him. No expectation. Only presence. And presence, she realized, was something he had never truly offered anyone before. One evening after her broadcast ended, Lila found him waiting outside the building. Not inside a boardroom. Not behind glass walls. Just standing beneath the soft city lights, hands in his coat pockets, looking almost uncertain. "You're still here," she said gently, approaching him. "I said I would be," he replied simply. A small pause. Then she stepped closer, not closing the distance all at once, but carefully, as if respecting something fragile between them. "You know," she said softly, "this started with a voice." Ethan nodded slightly. and ended with the person behind it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, unaware of how quietly something meaningful was forming in its midst. Then Lila did something neither of them had planned. She stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was steady. Real. Ethan stood still at first, surprised not by the gesture itself but by the feeling of it. Warmth. Presence. Something human he had long forgotten how to receive. Then slowly, he returned the embrace. Not tightly. Not possessively. Just enough to say, I'm here. When they finally let go, nothing had to be explained. Because some things don't need explanation. They only need to be felt. Months later, Lila's voice still went out over the airwaves every night. But now, when she spoke about loneliness or hope or healing, she wasn't speaking into the dark anymore. She knew someone was listening. Not as a stranger. Not as a mystery. But as someone who had once found her voice in the silence. And chosen to stay.